The headline is blunt and accurate. 80 days on, no publicly identified suspect, no confirmed trace of Savannah Guthrie's mother. That framing, used in reporting this week, is the honest accounting of where the Nancy Guthrie investigation stands in its public dimension. The honest accounting is not the same as the investigative reality, which may be significantly more advanced. But the public record must be engaged with honestly, and the public record at 80 days contains exactly what that headline says. This analysis does not avoid that framing. It engages with it directly, because an honest assessment of the case requires holding the convergence of investigative progress visible in prior weeks alongside the absence of public confirmation that is visible this week. The FBI is described as closing in on the suspect. DNA data has been received from the hair sample analysis. A genetic genealogist has called the hair evidence a potential Hail Mary. Masked intruder footage is being probed. A new disturbing ransom message has arrived. 5 specific anomalies that do not add up have been formally cataloged. The sheriff has issued a harsh warning while defending the case. A former FBI agent has offered expensive advice for finding Nancy Guthrie. These are the inputs this analysis works with at day 80. And the output of this analysis is an honest, systemic assessment of what they collectively mean for the investigation's realistic trajectory, its institutional architecture, and the human reality at its center. The closing in framing requires systemic translation before it can be analytically useful. Closing in is a phrase that appears in reporting on criminal investigations when sources with knowledge of the investigation's current state believe the field of possible suspects has been narrowed to the point where specific confirmation actions are underway. It is different from making progress, which describes a direction. Closing in describes a position. It says that the investigation is near something, not simply moving toward it. The basis for the closing in framing in this specific reporting is the receipt of DNA data from the hair sample analysis. DNA data, in the context of this investigation, means one of several things. It could mean a preliminary profile has been extracted and is being processed for database comparison. It could mean a complete profile has been generated and comparison has produced a candidate match that is being verified. Or it could mean that the analysis has been partially completed and has narrowed the field of possible contributors in ways that are directing the investigation towards specific individuals. The distinction between those 3 possibilities matters significantly for the realistic timeline of the next development. A preliminary profile requiring further processing means additional weeks. A complete profile in database comparison means days to weeks, depending on the matching process. A candidate match in verification means the investigation may be hours or days from a formal identification. What the public record cannot tell us is which of those 3 scenarios is current. The closing in framing is consistent with any of them. The escalation of expert commentary about the genetic genealogy approach as a potential Hail Mary suggests that the conventional database matching process has not yet produced a clean, confirmed identification, and that the genealogical research path may be in progress or under consideration. The systemic picture that emerges from this framing is one of an investigation that is at the furthest advanced point it has reached in terms of forensic progress, but that has not yet translated that progress into a public identification. The gap between forensic progress and public identification is the space that characterizes the closing in phase of any investigation. It is real progress, but it is not yet conclusion. The 5 anomalies that do not add up about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance deserve systemic attention because they represent the investigative boundaries that the available evidence and analysis have not yet bridged. In any investigation that is extended to 80 days with the level of resource and attention that this one has received, the anomalies that remain formally unresolved are the ones that are either most deliberately concealed or most structurally resistant to the available analytical frameworks. The 5 anomalies identified this week fall into the broader investigative picture in a way that is consistent with the insider theory that has been the dominant analytical framework for several weeks. An insider who planned this crime carefully would have anticipated exactly the kinds of investigative questions that produce anomalies. They would have created ambiguity in timing, in evidence, in communication, and in behavioral record that makes the 5 anomalies difficult to bridge with the available information. Deliberately engineered anomalies are a form of forensic signature in their own right. The specific things that do not add up are not random gaps in an imperfect investigation. They are gaps that a careful, planful perpetrator created because those specific gaps were the ones most likely to slow or misdirect the investigation. The insider who knew Nancy Guthrie well enough to identify which moments and which evidence types would be most important to obscure has created a specific pattern of obscuration that is itself investigatively informative. The FBI's probing of masked intruder footage is potentially a direct response to one or more of these anomalies. If one of the 5 things that does not add up is a question about who was in or near Nancy Guthrie's home at a specific time, and if footage exists that captures a masked individual at or near that time, the footage is the investigative response to the anomaly. The closing in framing suggests that investigators believe they are addressing these anomalies in ways that are converging on a resolution. Sheriff Nanos's harsh 5-word warning is, in the systemic analysis, an expression of the local agency's frustration with being evaluated through the lens of its anomalies, its communication failures, and its leadership controversies, rather than through the lens of the investigative progress that it claims to be making. A sheriff who feels that the investigation's actual progress is being undervalued by public criticism would issue exactly this kind of warning. Whether the frustration is justified depends on whether the investigation's actual progress is as advanced as the closing in framing suggests. The systemic tension between the department's credibility challenges and the federal investigation's forensic progress is the defining institutional characteristic of this case at 80 days. It will be resolved in the public dimension by whatever the next development produces. If the DNA analysis results in a public identification, the forensic progress will be visible and the credibility challenges will recede into the background of a successful investigation. If the identification is delayed further, the credibility challenges will continue to accumulate alongside the forensic weighting. The genetic genealogist's Hail Mary assessment is the expert contribution this week that carries the most systemic weight because it describes the single most decision-critical forensic moment in the investigation's current phase. The Hail Mary framing is analytically precise in a way that casual usage of the phrase often is not. A Hail Mary, in forensic terms, is not a desperate last resort from a position of certain failure. It is a high-stakes, high probability of success attempt that requires specific conditions to be met, and that, if those conditions are met, resolves a situation that could not be resolved through more routine means. The Hail Mary in the Guthrie case is the hair DNA sent to the FBI. If it produces a clean enough profile for forensic genetic genealogy, and if the genealogical research process produces an identification, the case is effectively solved at the forensic level. The subsequent investigative steps of verification, arrest, and prosecution are demanding, but are fundamentally different in character from the open search that has characterized the past 80 days. What the genetic genealogist's timeline insight adds to this framework is practical specificity. The Hail Mary is not an instantaneous throw. It requires weeks to months of specialized research after the initial profile comparison produces genealogical database matches. The investigation at 80 days may be partway through that research phase, which would explain both the closing in framing and the continued absence of a public identification. The expensive advice from the former FBI agent in this systemic context is likely a recommendation to invest whatever additional resources are necessary to complete the genetic genealogy process as quickly as possible, including potentially engaging specialized private firms with specific expertise in forensic genealogical research. The characterization of the advice as expensive reflects the real cost differential between standard forensic work and the specialized genealogical research firms that have driven the most successful applications of this technique. The systemic picture at day 80 is one in which the investigation's most critical forensic moment is either approaching or already underway, in a phase that requires time to complete, but that, if successful, will produce the result that resolves the central question of this investigation. Savannah Guthrie's return to her morning broadcast and her tribute through her outfit is the human expression of the same moment. She is not retreating from her professional life. She is continuing it while carrying what she is carrying. And the investigation she is waiting for is in the systemic analysis closer to what she is waiting for than it has been at any prior point. Subscribe here to stay with this coverage as it arrives at what this analysis believes is the final phase of this investigation's public journey. The full systemic assessment of the Nancy Guthrie investigation at 80 days requires engaging directly with the tension between the convergence signals visible in the public record and the 80 days no suspect reality that reporting has characterized this week. Those two things can be simultaneously true. An investigation can be genuinely closing in on an identification while that identification has not yet been made. A forensic process can be at its most advanced state while still requiring additional time. The public record can show genuine investigative progress while the public identification that would represent its most visible expression has not yet arrived. The 5 anomalies that do not add up are the hardest version of this tension. They represent the places where the convergence is incomplete, where the investigative framework that has produced the closing in framing has not yet bridged every gap. Those gaps may be bridged by the DNA analysis, by the video forensics, by a witness who responds to the appeals that have been made, or by some combination of all three. The dark tourists at the memorial represent the social dimension of this sustained tension. People who have physically traveled to connect with a case that is not yet resolved are expressing the same tension in human form, the desire for resolution that is not yet available, and the sustained engagement with the situation in the absence of that resolution. What the systemic analysis concludes at 80 days is this: the investigation is in its most forensically advanced state. The closing in framing is consistent with the evidence. The genetic genealogy path is the most promising remaining forensic avenue. The video forensics on the masked intruder footage adds a new evidential dimension. And the 5 anomalies that remain unresolved are the investigative challenge that the next significant development will need to address. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 80 days. The investigation is active. The people working it are not done, and the analysis is not done either. The next development, when it arrives, will be covered here with the same depth and precision that this coverage has maintained from the beginning, because this case and the woman at its center deserve nothing less. The honest accounting of where this case stands at 80 days requires more than simply noting the absence of a public identification. It requires examining what the absence of a public identification at this specific point, given the accumulated evidence and the closing in framing, tells us about the investigation's realistic timeline and the nature of the remaining forensic challenge. An investigation that is genuinely closing in on a suspect but has not yet made a public identification is typically in one of 3 states. First, it may have identified a specific suspect internally, but is still completing the verification process before making an arrest. In this state, the investigation has a name, has evidence pointing to that name, and is building the evidentiary case to a standard that will withstand prosecution. This state can last days to weeks depending on the complexity of the verification process. Second, it may have narrowed the suspect field significantly through forensic and analytical work to the point where a small number of specific individuals are under active investigation, but has not yet produced the single conclusive identification from that narrowed field. In this state, the investigation knows approximately who the perpetrator is, but needs the final piece of evidence to confirm which specific individual is responsible. This state is also consistent with the genetic genealogy Hail Mary framing, because the genealogical research process is exactly the kind of work that moves an investigation from a narrowed field to a specific identification. Third, it may have identified the specific individual, but is waiting to act for operational reasons, such as the concern that premature public identification or arrest will affect the possibility of locating Nancy Guthrie. In cases where the victim may still be alive, investigators face a strategic choice about when to move against the suspected perpetrator, because arrest can trigger outcomes that are bad for the victim's safety if the perpetrator has set contingencies in place. The closing in framing is consistent with all three states. What the framing does not tell the public is which state the investigation is actually in. That distinction has profound implications for the realistic timeline of the next development. The 5 anomalies that remain unresolved are potentially the mechanism that tells us which state the investigation is in. If the anomalies are questions about who, they suggest the investigation is in state 2. Still closing on a specific identification. If the anomalies are questions about where, they suggest the investigation may be in state 3, where Nancy Guthrie's location is the remaining unknown, even as the perpetrator is identified or nearly identified. If the anomalies are questions about how, they suggest the investigation is working to complete the evidentiary case in state 1. The genetic genealogy Hail Mary, the video forensics on the masked intruder footage, and the expensive advice from the former FBI agent are all tools that are most useful in transitioning from one state to the next. The genealogy work is most useful in state 2, providing the specific identification from a narrowed field. The video forensics are most useful in any state, providing additional evidence that contributes to both identification and evidentiary case building. The expensive advice, whatever it specifically recommends, is most useful if it addresses the specific bottleneck in whichever state the investigation currently occupies. The systemic analysis concludes that the investigation is most likely in state 2 at 80 days. The suspect field has been significantly narrowed through forensic and analytical work, and the remaining challenge is producing the specific identification from that narrowed field. The genetic genealogy path is the most promising tool for that specific challenge, and the timeline for that tool to produce a result is measured in weeks to months from the point at which the genealogical database comparison begins. If the comparison began in the past several weeks, which the closing and framing would suggest, the identification may be approaching the end of its research phase. And when that research produces its result, the investigation will transition rapidly from the closing in state to the conclusive identification state. That transition, when it happens, will be the development that answers the question that has been at the center of this case for 80 days. The dark tourists at the memorial are, in this systemic framing, a social signal that the public engagement with the case has not diminished despite the absence of dramatic new developments. Sustained public engagement is a form of pressure on the investigative process that is distinct from formal witness appeals. It says that the community's attention remains active, that new information would find a receptive and engaged audience if it emerged, and that the investigation is being watched in a way that motivates continued effort. Savannah Guthrie's return to her broadcast with a tribute to her mother is the human expression of the same sustained engagement. She is not retreating from the case in her public life. She is continuing to acknowledge it through the most visible means available to her, while managing the constraints that professional and investigative context places on what she can say directly. The investigation is 80 days old. The honest assessment says no public suspect, no confirmed trace. The closing in framing says the forensic progress is real. The Hail Mary DNA says the most critical forensic moment is either approaching or already underway. The masked intruder footage says a new category of visual evidence is being examined. The 5 anomalies say the investigation's understanding is still incomplete in specific, identifiable ways. These are not contradictory statements. They are simultaneous truths about an investigation that is at the most complex and most critical phase it has yet reached. The systemic analysis holds all of them together, and the analysis continues. The ex-FBI agent's expensive advice in this concluding systemic frame is the most practically oriented contribution of the week. Expensive advice is advice that requires investment to implement. In an investigation at 80 days that is described as closing in but has not yet produced a public identification, the most useful investment is the one that closes the gap between the narrowed field and the specific identification most quickly. Forensic genetic genealogy, the technique the genetic genealogist has described as the Hail Mary, is exactly that investment. The agencies with the most success in applying this technique are specialized private firms whose expertise far exceeds what standard law enforcement forensic divisions routinely deploy. The expensive advice is almost certainly a recommendation to engage one of those firms if it has not already been done. The investigation's response to that recommendation, whether it has been implemented, whether it is in progress, and how far along the genealogical research phase has advanced, will determine whether the closing in framing translates into a public identification in days, weeks, or months. That is the honest answer to the timeline question that everyone connected to this case is asking. And it is the answer this systemic analysis can provide based on what the public record, the expert commentary, and the investigative framing available this week together support. The investigation continues. The analysis continues with it. And Nancy Guthrie deserves the most honest, most rigorous, and most complete public accounting of her case that this coverage can provide. That is what this analysis has committed to from the beginning. And that commitment does not end until the case does.